Hey, good day, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the OIG Roundtable. The gang's all here today. We have a really good topic we're going to be talking about today. As always, I'm joined by the whole group. I got Wade McFowle, like me, wearing a t-shirt. Wade McFowle, retired assistant special agent in charge from the OIG out of the LA field office, now a member of our SIU investigative team. Matt Kachansky, retired executive from HHS OIG and the retired UPIC Northeast director. And of course, he's wearing a collared shirt. And Jaysen Eisengrind, retired leader from OIG and the retired Western UPIC director and my mentor in life, my mentor at the OIG. He's also wearing a collared shirt. And the reason I bring that up is Jaysen suggested that going forward, we all wear collared shirts, of which I decided that Wade and I were going to be the rebels. And I am still Eric Rubenstein, the Senior Director of Litigation, Fraud, Waste, and Abuse here at Advize. So we want to spend this podcast talking about consistency. And we really want to focus on consistency from the SIU side. Matt and I just came back from a client last week. We were on a 3-day boot camp for SIU investigators. Matt and I and Jaysen and Wade, we put together a 3-day training for this one particular client of ours to kind of have a level set with their SIU. We took essentially the best practices from the OIG's Special Agent Basic Training, which is the add-on training that comes after new agents graduate from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. So agents graduate from what's known as FLETC after about 12 weeks now. And that course is anybody who's a criminal investigator or special agent with the government, with the exception of the FBI, the DEA, and the Postal Inspection Service. They all go to their own academies. But at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, every other federal agency that have criminal investigators or special agents, they all go to the same training. We all sit in the same class together. Then you go about your day. Well, when you go about your day at HHS OIG, the OIG operates a National Operations Center, which has an add-on training that they do for new agents so that agents can learn how to do healthcare fraud. We took essentially a 3 or 4 week training module, block of training. We condensed it down to just the kind of the key points in the healthcare space. We did a 3-day training that included everything from how to document interviews, how to do interviews in a live and a virtual setting, including telephone and Teams. We talked about data analytics. We talked about a lot of things, and it culminated with a half-a-day practical with a case and a walkthrough and live interviews, mock interviews, Teams-related type interviews, and telephonic interviews. And the one thing that we, got out of that was the real important need for consistency. Matt and I would query the group. It was about 15 investigators, and we would ask a question. And for 15 different people, we got 25 different answers in some regard. And so consistency is very important. And that's consistency in documentation, consistency in the methodology on how you document an interview, how you transcribe it, just consistency in everything. And so that consistency has a lot of collateral positive effects, very few negative effects. So Wade, I want to start with you because we're gonna go in reverse chronological order. You're currently on a contract now doing investigative work for a large payer in one of the Medicaid spaces. And there are some issues with consistency, right? You've got different people in supervisory roles providing different advice and suggestions, which is one thing, right? Because 2 different people may look at something a different way, but there's generally a consistency that doesn't exist in what are internal metrics for certain things and making referrals. And so let's talk about it, currently, but then I want to go to historically when you were an agent and you were an ASAC, the importance of consistency in doing an investigation. And I don't mean that every investigation has the same roadmap, but a consistency in, you will take notes, you will document your interviews within X number of days. So let's talk about some of the, I don't want to call it turmoil, but some of the, when there's a lack of consistency, what does that wind up breeding?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different areas to hit on here. One, which you already did, is the kind of the marching orders coming down from management as far as like the direction things should go, and not only the direction, but like how to get there. Excuse me, the steps on how to get there. I do think there is a lot of there's a need for having consistency, like you said, in documentation, and that primarily I think comes from the methodology that's used to do reports and referrals and things of that nature. So I think it's really important to have like a shared drive where everybody is pulling from the same kind of templates. And I think there's a pretty decent use of templates to get like the basic form of referrals and letters and different reports down. But I think there's probably a lack of detail in the actual once you get the templated information down, there's always some free flow narrative that needs to be done in explaining, the details of the case. And I think that's someplace where we kind of lose. I'm seeing a lack of consistency where you have the template to get the basics down, but then there's a wide variety of, from the from the OIG days, it was more of a put in, I have tons of information, I'm going to put it all in there because the reader, whoever, whether it's a referral that's going out or whatever, they can determine what they want. And now we're seeing more of a minimum necessary approach. So I think that in that part, the narrative tends to be kind of all over the place, where one narrative for the same case, if you had 5 different investigators write up the same case, you'd have one that's in the free flow narrative, one that's a paragraph that's definitely minimum necessary. And I could make that same information into like 7 or 8 paragraphs, but that's one area that there's, I think, inconsistency. People coming from different backgrounds. Me from the OIG, we would throw all the details in there and let the audience or the reader decide what they need. And I think that's one of the inconsistencies I see now, is it's somewhere between throwing everything but the kitchen sink and a really minimalist necessary minimal necessary involvement. So that's one area I see as inconsistent.
Yeah, and that's a good point. Like, you've got to have, obviously, if 2 different people are doing interviews in 2 different cases, what they think to be relevant is going to, vary, and it's going to change. But I think that, I think the one area that we've seen kind of across the board in some of our process improvement work has been that the lack of consistency when it comes to documenting an interview. For example, we found that there was a lot of variance, in the way that was done. People had their own kind of way that they wanted to do it, and it just didn't seem like there was any sort of standardization of it. And that's a policy issue, right? A process improvement issue. So, Matt, I want to go to you, because one of the things that we did for this client as part of a process improvement review was created an entire manual on on-sites and kind of the roadmap of on-sites. And we talked a lot about on-sites because this particular plan does a fair amount of on-sites. And we talked about consistency for on-sites. But, Wade brought up a good point, which is like minimum necessary versus throwing the baby in the bathwater. But that also, lends itself towards when you're doing a referral to law enforcement. And I know I lean on you a lot on these podcasts when we talk about things like the major case coordination, the MCC, and is a case really ripe enough? Is it being referred to early? From an SIU perspective, we're already learning SIUs really don't enjoy making referrals to law enforcement unless it's the absolute worst of the worst, because then a case could sit with a law enforcement organization. And the OIG was guilty of this, just like everybody else, of having a case for a couple of years and then it kind of goes at the wayside. But, consistency in referrals is also a very important piece of the puzzle, right?
Yes, absolutely. Because law enforcement is expecting certain things in the packages that they receive from SIUs, whether it be the UPIC or any other SIU. They're expecting, a certain amount of information that they can make a decision whether the case is worthwhile to accept or not, just based on the information that they're receiving. With the MCC, it was a great step in terms of bringing law enforcement and the UPICs together with CMS in a formal partnership again. But the downside of the MCC was it brought all the administrative remedies into play as well. So there were criteria set up, consistent criteria set up as to when to bring a case to the MCC. And it was when you believed it was ready for a payment suspension or a prepay or a statistical SVRS extrapolation, as well as a referral. And the way it happened was, some of these things would just be data, maybe a medical review, and it was being brought because it met one of those criteria. But at the MCC, the right of first refusal was the OIG. So they'd be hearing these cases very prematurely without all of the facts, brought into play, because the UPIC didn't have time to do all of the Benny interviews necessary or things like that, because, it's ready for a payment suspension just because of the data. And so there was this lack of consistency in what was being brought. So the acceptance percentages started to go down as the OIG started, running out of resources to look at these things, and B, I think the cases were becoming more and more premature to be brought forward because the UPICs had, I won't say metrics, but they had expectations as to how many they were supposed to bring and when they were supposed to bring them. So it was almost too rigid in the approach.
So it's almost like talking about police departments don't have ticket quotas, but they have a ticket quota.
Yeah, don't speed at the end of the month. Yeah.
Yeah, like I have a friend who's an executive with a pretty large police department here in New Jersey, and he'll always say, no, we don't have ticket quotas, but when we do our annual reviews of cops, when they get rated, their proactive traffic enforcement becomes a rateable. So there's no quota, but you get a rating for it. So Jaysen, so now I want to go to you because, from an operational perspective, a lack of consistency can have a really negative effect on things like morale and retention. But a consistent policy or set of procedures can have the opposite effect, right? It can keep people engaged, and I see that is a combination of policy, but also practice and culture.
Yes, and this happens to be an area that I'm really passionate about, so I'm going to try to get as many points as I can before Eric gets out his virtual hook. And if you see my image ghosting, it's Eric trying to cut me off. So let's start with the why. So why invest in this this set of mitigations, if you will? It's all about the fact that we're all way overtasked and we have deliverables with very tight time frames. And it's very difficult, as Eric already said about retention, it's very difficult to staff our organizations now. So what we're talking about here are the mitigations to that. And in the world of quality, we want to replicate those things that work really well. We want to offer efficiencies that are going to allow us to multiply our staff without actually adding FTEs to that, if at all possible. And as Eric already said, again, retain those that we've already invested a lot of money in bringing on and recruiting, because obviously what we're all doing, it isn't something that you can just get somebody in the door and in 1 week they are, meeting expectations and producing the products that we all need to satisfy our deliverables. And many of the things that it takes to do all that are relatively easy, but as easy as it does require a set of policies and procedures and training about those policies and procedures. I'm a big fan when Wade mentioned about checklists and templates. That is a good place to start. As far as procedures go, some examples of some procedures that would be really important. And to Matt's point about the information that we're presenting to our stakeholders needs to satisfy their needs. So learning about how to take notes and what to focus on in your interviews and information gathering is really important, right? Like, are people focusing on intent so that the stakeholders can decide, is this a criminal referral? Is it a civil enforcement? Is it an administrative? Or is this an educational outcome? And that can help then drive that we aren't, as somebody already mentioned, putting in the kitchen sink when it's just not necessary for having the kitchen sink in that particular instance, and gobbling up resources when it's not really going to end in a positive outcome doing all that. So what sounds fairly simple, if you all want to kind of get a glimpse at what the government does, I would go to the Office of Counsel for Inspectors General and look at, they've already laid out what the quality standards of investigation are and the quality standards of audits are. And that's a good place to start. The reality is, though, that you still need to dissect that, find out what's applicable to your mission and organization, and then tailor a set of policies and procedures to put in place. So again, people aren't wandering, trying to figure out, well, after a 12-page interview review report, and the reality is in the first page, you could have covered what you needed to cover. And then there are other things that are not going to be in there. So the Office of Inspector General for HHS spent a lot of money and on an individual's program, and rest his soul, Dr. Wayne Knoll from Georgetown. He was phenomenal at providing direction on how to write a coherent interview report. And I always thought of myself, and self-praise is no praise, but as a fairly good writer. I learned so much from Dr. Knoll in terms of organizing my thoughts in terms of a written product, and little things like bullet points and segmenting the information into the relevant areas that I mentioned a little while ago. They go a long way. And again, so the concept might be in that more grand document of a quality standard of investigation, like have a great, documentation level, but on the reality, there is details in that, and frankly, participated a very little bit in the fine work that Eric and Matt did on that 3 days of training, and it was really awesome to see the development of those SIU investigators and what they got from the practical exercises and things of that nature. And that's a little tip of the hat to them, of course, but it's also a tip of the hat to practicals, because if your training is going to be just force feeding a set of circumstances and rules, after about 55 minutes, people's attention span just can't last. And that's a tip of the hat to the FLETC standard. Was training is in 55-minute segments, because they realize that people just can't focus, but also then practicing what it is that you're training on. So I'll leave it there before the virtual hook comes out. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's all really good points. And one point that you just brought up, kind of to close this out, because we are running a little bit out of time, is the premise of we weren't running out of time until you got going, Jaysen, but that's okay. But the premise of the checklist, and man, I will tell you, for every single block of instruction, the question kept coming up: is there a checklist that we can get for every case? And the response I gave was no. You shouldn't be working on a standard checklist that fits. Not every foot goes in every shoe. There were some standard things that we said, look, you should always be looking at the following 5 or 6 or 7 things, but you really can't have a checklist that covers every single thing, because even, if you've worked on a cardiology case and now you have another cardiology case, the facts may be different. The rules that you're looking at may be different. So there's some standards that you should have that kind of create that level set, that consistency to kind of get you going. I will say that we got an amazing amount of feedback on the practical. What we did was we really had all of the things that we spent some 2.5 days on really culminated with this. It was, it ultimately led to the last block of instruction that Matt did, which was, okay, we're going to make a referral to law enforcement based upon the past 2.5 days of what we did and this practical. What would that referral look like? Our practical included a review of data, a review of policies, interviews with mock interviews with patients, the provider. It was as comprehensive as we could possibly do, and that really was the thing that drove it. That kind of drove it home. So the consistency piece is something I think that doesn't ever go away. When you break that consistency, and look, I think the biggest thing that we learned is that there are instances when there is going to be a reluctance of the organization to that consistency, because you've got people who have been there for 10 or 15 years and they've done it a certain way. And, obviously nobody likes change. And, the things that we were talking about weren't really tectonic shifts and tectonic changes. They were little tweaks to things that they were already doing well. And I think that the biggest buy-in on consistency is getting people to come off of the fact that they believed that the things that they were doing for all of the years previously was the best practice. It's almost like when you go to a provider and you say something to them and they say, well, it's never been a problem before. And my general response is it never been a problem because you've been audited or investigated and someone told you it wasn't a problem, or because no one's ever brought it to your attention, right? If you're doing something wrong consistently, but it's never come to light, it's almost it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So that's really an important piece. I mean, I think what I got out of our 3-day training was that there were more areas where there was a lack of consistency that we were even aware of at the time, but it came out during that 3-day training. And that really does provide an ability for process improvements to come in. And I think one of the things we all agree about is that the consistency is a living and breathing and evolving thing. It's like a policy or a procedure. It shouldn't just go with the wayside. It should kind of, always be out in the forefront. So as always, there's never enough time to talk about all things that we want to talk about, other than next week we'll all try to wear either a t-shirt or a collared shirt. We'll see where that goes. Wade and I are already halfway there. We at least matched on the shirts, but whatever. It is what it is.
I'm picturing Jaysen in a t-shirt tuxedo thing.
Yeah, he may actually have that. So as always, I enjoy the time I spend with you. To our viewers and our listeners, we always really appreciate and respect the time that you take to listen to the four of us pontificate. Again, if you're not getting our newsletter, hello at Advize, ADVIZE health.com. Tune into our podcasts. We have a great LinkedIn Live coming up in July. I'll be doing a LinkedIn Live with Eli Rushbanks from $4, an amazing charity. We're going to talk a lot about the intersection of charity care, which is also known as disproportionate share hospital payments, and the intersection of that with fraud, waste, abuse, and compliance. So that's going to be a great one. Keep your eyes open for that one in July. And until next week, gents, I appreciate your time as always, and we'll see you on the next podcast.
Yeah.
Thank you all.